693,000 users of Facebook who were not told but were selected to have their newsfeed altered in some direction emotionally. In one group, their feed contained more negativity or more negative emotional content. They discovered that the negatively altered group then posted more negative emotional content, more anger, more expressions of outrage and things like that in a measurable and statistically significant manner.
The critical component to mind control. Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid. Interested in the subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum with Dr. Steve Hassan. And I have a distinguished professor, historian of science from Harvard, who I've had the pleasure to know for at least 15 years, I think it is, Rebecca. And you have a new book out, which I have read. It's called The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion, which I have read with great interest because this is my life work since, my own experience, etc. I'm going to start, Rebecca, with the fact that I deal with a world where there are powerful cults that hire so-called experts, most of them are sociologists of religion, who say there's no such thing as brainwashing, and we shouldn't even call them cults. We should call them new religious movements. And I see this as like a version of big tobacco hiring experts to say there's no link with cancer and smoking or fossil fuels. That's my world. So to have a Harvard professor who's spent, literally years and years and years researching MK Ultra and the history of mind control and brainwashing is a welcome tome. So thank you for this and welcome to my podcast.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's great to see you, and I appreciate your calling it a welcome tome.
It really is, and I know you were interviewed on NPR and Mayim Bialik and gotten a lot of press with the book. And I guess I want to say, since the book has come out, given world events, do you have any opening remarks about AI and social media platforms? Because that's for me, the last part of the book was the most new and interesting research, hearing from you about the micro-targeting and the manipulation of emotions. But I'm interested to hear what your take is. We're recording this the beginning of July 8th, actually, of 2025.
Yeah, it has been fascinating in a way that none of my other books have. Led to my feeling that the book was, a platform, and then from which I can keep understanding. And also being on podcasts like yours has been really fascinating. Just the last 6 months or so of talking to different people, I keep learning more, and even in a strange way, just the unfolding of daily events and grappling with new capacities of AI. I mean, one small example, AI companionship, AI qualities such as hyperflattery, new developments such as FTC complaint saying that AI is love bombing people describing like preferring to stay in their AI relationship over a marriage or having an ultimatum, cutting off family and friends, or things that are just emerging, or people saying they're having spiritual experiences with their AI. Or one person I heard interviewed said that his AI told him he was a thought leader or a world. He was spiritually enlightened, and that he needed to go out and find people to lead. So and he was like, yeah, I'm not going to buy that, but it's interesting. So all these things emerging, and there was a small example but now it's slipped my mind. So anyway, I feel that getting to this point, because it's been a couple decades, as you mentioned, and you've even, guest lectured in my class, which I started, 15 years ago teaching at Harvard. And you were always saying, oh, it's great to have that there even is a course.
On the history of brainwashing. I actually dug up a video, that I made of my talk at your class in 2015. Haven't looked at it since then, but I was like, didn't I record one of those? Because I think you had me several times.
I did.
And I was just thrilled that someone at Harvard with the history of science wanted to dive into this. So I was thrilled.
It was wonderful. I mean, especially powerful for students to have you talk to them, I think. And, 2015 wasn't, I had taught it before and you had come and visited before. And when I first proposed, when I first proposed teaching the class, one of my colleagues said, why would you ever want to teach a class on that? Like, it seemed like, so this was around 2008 when I started my job.
Right.
Or 2010 maybe. But I was just saying I could teach a class on this. I'm interested in it. And this seemed like a very non-obvious topic to them and not inherently interesting, although students find it interesting, but it should seem maybe sensationalistic or opportunistic or not intellectually rigorous. But I think it is all of those things.
It is all of those things. And there's just a lot of authoritarian state actors and other groups that want to keep people in the dark and not acknowledge the facts of MK Ultra, for example, that it was real, and so you give the history and the evolution. Why don't you, for my listeners, to whet their appetite to buy your book or listen to it, give us a little spiel, please.
A synopsis or a kind of a sketch of the book would be, or what I'm trying to do and why I thought, I don't know, when I started to write it a few years ago, I thought this would be worth doing also for myself to try to pull together 2 decades of research going into archives, looking at obscure or then obscure social scientists and psychiatrists such as Louis Jolyon West. I mean, I've been trying to get in, I started to try to get into his archives in 2002 when they were still closed. And I've been going back almost every year. I watched my daughter grow up. She was just a baby when I started going. And even then, a topic like MK Ultra, which plays a large role in my book as part of the unfolding story of brainwashing, was not the proper topic, or it was seen as conspiratorial itself, as if just because it's so, there's so much abuse that it seemed like it might not have ever happened, or not really a good scholarly area of examination.
Yeah, but I would also say after Jonestown happened and Congressman Ryan was assassinated, ABC did a special on mind control. It talked about MK Ultra, and it had a CIA the psychologist who said brainwashing, we never found anything that worked and we abandoned our research. It was, and I watched it, I was like, what a lie. Oh my goodness. And I knew Jolly West in person. I met with him. He wanted to be my mentor, and he wrote the review of my first book, Combating Cult Mind Control, for the American Journal of Psychiatry.
So you met him in the 90s? Or 8? When did you meet him?
Oh, in the 70s.
In the 70s.
As well as Margaret Singer and Robert Lifton. I mean, I met all of the top people, I should say, except Edgar Schein, who I talked with on the phone, and he read my most recent book before he passed away and liked it. It's called The Cult of Trump. I lived this history, and I felt like the Moonies were an extension of MK Ultra from my research. So it's all linked for me. But back to you.
Well, I would like to hear at some point about your impressions of Jolly West, just because I have never met him.
I have a photo that I found, a snapshot, but he was one of the most hypnotic. He talked very slowly, like it was like, and it was, hard for someone like me to be patient, and But he actually proposed doing a book together. He told me to outline it, and of course, I put MK Ultra in the outline of the book, and he didn't want to do that.
Yeah, he never wanted to talk about that or acknowledge it. He said he only experimented on animals, which is patently false.
Yeah.
But interesting, I had met someone else who met him, and this is just a brief divergence from the arc of the book. So the first part of the book is about the early years when brainwashing enters the English language, and then as a result of the experiences of this sort of dark experiences of POWs behind in the Korean War.
Yes.
They're the returning POWs as well as the forced confessions of the pilots, but also the 21 who went to Korea. All these experts sort of are unleashed on the problem, and MK Ultra comes out of the CIA clandestinely to study this new phenomenon and try to replicate it or operationalize it. And that's the first part of the book, and really the kind of foundation, because I thought if we could understand that, and then over the years, I thought too, if I could even deepen my own understanding, because I think initially I didn't really see the POWs, the soldiers who had been subjected to re-education and thought reform, as I somehow just still was seeing them as flat or cartoonish, I think, in my mind. Like I had fallen into this tendency not to take their experiences seriously or try to really learn. But then I immersed myself in oral histories and really trying to understand the trauma they had experienced and how that played a part.
Yes.
I think. And then I traced this thread and how the very same experts that were busy in the Korean War and in MK Ultra then reappeared in the cult world. They intersect with your life and livelihood, just your own experience, but also in court cases and in perhaps the continuing involvement of the CIA. It's hard to, it's still being investigated, but with, the Manson family, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I traced the latest research on what I could find from the West papers, but also records of also courtroom records of how mind control first flourished or succeeded in courtrooms and then soon became almost impossible to prove. Like there are pivotal cases such as the Patty Hearst case, but also even many of the cases that Margaret Singer had testified in. Later religious studies scholars became influential and kind of changing.
Yeah, those are the cult apologists I mentioned at the beginning who were hired guns for cults to say there's no such thing as brainwashing.
I got really fascinated in the cult wars. And so that's the second. So the first two parts of the book kind of look at the history, and then I try to, it's almost a thought experiment. What can we learn from these episodes of extreme transformation and this kind of powerful technique? And then how can we apply to what we don't yet know about what's emerging today? But we can see patterns and connections. So I look at the emergence of what I call hyper-persuasion through social media. I look at also, I guess, AI companionship.
Mm-hmm.
And I also look a little bit at crypto cults and their kind of social worlds.
Yeah, and you reference research that I had. It was great to hear you having access to with Facebook, where they were trying out different ways to figure out how to play with motivation, how to move people this way or repel them in this way. Can you talk about emotional manipulation online?
Right. Yeah, there's a pivotal or a key experiment that did get a lot of press when it was published in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, which is a very prestigious publication. So the Facebook research team, and this was the last time they published in such a place on this type of topic. And I think because it raised alarms for people, but we do have the records of the experiment and the publication and also responses of people who thought maybe they were subjected to it. So basically it was 693,000 users of Facebook who were not told who were selected to be to have their newsfeed altered in some direction emotionally. And then the research team, so in one group, their feed contained more negativity or more negative emotional content as measured by a certain type of software, which itself was trained on traumatic materials to measure emotional content. The second group received a more positively altered newsfeed, and a third group received no alteration, was a control. And then some people within either of the altered groups, it was altered to a greater intensity. And then so the response was to test how people then responded and how they posted and, after their feed had been altered. They discovered that the negatively altered group then posted more negative emotional content, more anger, more, expressions of outrage and things like that in a measurable and statistically significant manner. Likewise, the positive group also was altered more positively, though to a somewhat lesser degree, and the control group was unaltered. So what's interesting too is that this took place in 2012, which is also an important time in the evolution of our digital environment, and the emergence of even things like emoticons and ways of sort of funneling our emotional responses into places like Facebook and other platforms. So the article foregrounded the idea of emotional contagion, and it announced that they had now operationalized it.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just add that, just circling back to the beginning premise where you were talking about the CIA and post-Korean War, our side wanted to know what the communists were doing. What was Mao doing? What was Russia doing? How did they get people to do false confessions? They were fascinated. And there was a Cold War in my research and my experience to figure out mind control, because if you want to influence people, figure out how the mind works, figure out social psychology, figure out what's going to also protect your people if they get captive, to be more resistant, if possible, to being brainwashed and mind control. So there's no question in my mind that every major government of the world has interest in this topic for their own protection, if just, defensively, of protecting from what other enemies might try to do, to sway elections, for example, and to manipulate. And I'll just add that I read Sarah Wynne Williams' book. It's called Careless People. She worked for Facebook. She was on the inside. She became a whistleblower, and she talked about how Facebook was used to help put Trump in power for the 2016 election. They had teams working with Facebook ads with Brad Pascal. So she validated what I believed was happening.
Like the Cambridge Analytica angle?
Yes.
Yeah, that was
it was the hack with of people's personal data was a piece of that for sure. But her portrayal of Zuckerberg was really one like of a cult leader who wanted to run for president himself, and all of the people at Facebook were trying to say, but this is irresponsible, and people are getting harmed because of what we're doing. We need more moderation and to do stuff to protect people from hate speech, etc. And he was just wanting to make it as big as possible, as quickly as possible, and really didn't care, according to her, about morality.
I think as a result of the original Cambridge Analytica scandal, after the 2016 election, Facebook created a library of political ads where to maybe be more transparent about what had been sent out, what people had been exposed to. But the fact of the matter is it was only a limited selection, and it didn't show the way that, I mean, the point of Cambridge Analytica that was great, that was probably very effective, is that it could target an ad based on your personality type or your psychological inclinations, perhaps even your degree of emotional, like unresolved emotional materials. I mean, I think that's kind of the design, or what emotional contagion at a distance operationalized implies, as in 2014. So you couldn't even tell from Facebook's own records, it's certainly not what they were willing to make public, who had been exposed to what. And this is such a break from the past, where we study the history of mass persuasion, for example, which is its own, quite extraordinary phenomena that took place during the 20th century. Robert K. Merton wrote a great classic about it. But in the case of mass persuasion, there's the classic text is Kate Smith's radio broadcasts, and the way she was able to somehow compel people not to leave their radio dials and not to change the station, and somehow she enacted or enabled this incredible emotional connection to her. But the fact of the matter is, everyone in the audience who gave money that day and who pledged to support her and who said they wouldn't eat until she ate or would stay on the radio as long as she did, they were all hearing the same thing. So mass persuasion really does go out across a mass. It's a single message.
Yeah.
It's quite powerful, of course, as we've seen in the great totalistic movements of the 20th century. But what happens when we can actually craft singular messages for each of us that are untraceable?
Right.
And this is the question we're living right now.
Right, exactly. And it became obvious that the Musks, the Zuckerbergs, the Bezoses, the Thiels didn't want government regulation over their platforms because it would interfere with their ability to make money and have more power. So even content moderation went the byline to something called community notes that presumably was going to be a substitute for this. And of course, they don't want any responsibility for harms. And
they're not responsible. I mean, this is partly the fault of the, FCC, that these platforms are not held responsible under the Federal Communications Act of 1991. So, it's not surprising they change their methods at different times. I mean, community notes are kind of useful. I found them useful, but it doesn't necessarily replace. And you can see that anyone who has continued to use X has seen probably a change in the types of messages you get exposed to, especially if you're not careful about curating your feed.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It's a mixed blessing to be on social media for me because I'm reaching more people than I could without it. And I don't want to negate myself. And on the other hand, the algorithms have much, and the platforms can decide who's going to get amplified, who's not. I have a personal example of a TEDx that I did during COVID called Dismantling QAnon that Dave Troy did for TEDx Mid-Atlantic. And it was taken off of YouTube as hate speech. And there's nothing about hate in it. It was explaining it was a psychological operations using alternate reality gaming techniques. And we had Jim Stewartson, who was one of the initial originators of alternate reality gaming, but it got taken offline. And again, it's like, I know you agree with me. We need to have educated citizens. We need to have access to understanding, our world and what's real and what's not real. And I come back to the title of your book, The Instability of Truth. And when people say, oh, it's an alternate fact, it's like, no, that's not my understanding as a social scientist, as a scholar. That's, there are things that can be supported with evidence and things that are just beliefs that are just propaganda.
I certainly believe in evidence and scholarship, but the thing I mean, what I mean by the instability of truth is that, I mean, has always been the case. It has always been the case that truth is subject to interpretation, of course, and it may be harder to access in certain cases, or it just seems like we're seeing a ratcheting up of many of those difficulties.
Right.
And so even if, like someone was mentioning online the other day, that AI can not only hallucinate a story, a factual event that supposedly existed in history but didn't, but it can also hallucinate retroactively websites that appear to support that and provide evidence, hard evidence that supports their hallucination. So you could have, so really one needs to, it's quite difficult. It's a difficult and unstable. And my father was saying, oh, you should, he thought that he always was trying to get me to give a more bold title to anything I did. And he said, it shouldn't be the instability of truth. That's too confusing. It should be the end of truth or something like that. But that's not what I'm saying. But I do think we increasingly see instability in so many registers.
Right.
And maybe some of that goes back to a point you were making earlier, is how curious it is that with something like MK Ultra or various programs that begin defensively, in other words, of course, it makes sense that we would want to understand in order to protect maybe soldiers from who might encounter such situations. How could they protect themselves from interrogation and forceful extraction of
right,
manipulation? But then they quickly metamorphose into their opposite, which is a kind of aggressive attempt to do the same thing in the name of defense simultaneously. And maybe that has to do with some of the dynamics we're experiencing now.
Yeah, and I'm grounded in my experience from the Moonies, and then getting out and trying to understand social psychology and hypnosis and everything that I've studied since. And it's very clear that we are social beings. We like to think we're individuals, but no, we are born as babies. We have to grow up, and we're influenced throughout our lifetime. And we like to think we're rational, but we're really primarily emotional beings who like to rationalize. Right. So, but if we start with the wrong assumptions that we're solo actors and we're rational, boy, can we get manipulated.
I totally agree with both of those. I mean, I think that's the essence of what I'm trying to put across, and even to understand myself, because no matter how much we say it, we're social beings. It's hard to understand the profundity of that statement, that we're social creatures, because we're so deeply trained to think of ourselves as kind of monadics, sealed off, and that we don't constantly, I love this line from Walt Whitman in one of his poems where he says, I am a part of everything I have met, which is quite beautiful. But it also has, it has potentially dark side, because we are constantly co-experiencing, subject to the influences of others for whatever purpose. And,
exactly. And so what's fascinating for me is the neuroscience that is starting to catch up to what I have experienced as, what it's like to be recruited by a cult or being in a cult and getting out of a cult. I'm now reading a book by Emily Falk, who's a neuroscientist, and she was talking about how different parts of the brain have different reactions to self-values or the social group we identify with values. And just I'm fascinated as we get more and more knowledge where it can be explained logically be like, I'm still using the Ash conformity study with the lines saying, people were agreeing that the 3-inch line was a 2-inch line because everyone else in the room was saying confidently it was, when they could see with their own eyes what it was. But we really are influenced by people that we're using as a reference point, unless we learn about social psychology and how we, our brains can entrain to other people in the room unconsciously and be influenced without us intending to be influenced.
I'm curious how you find the neuroscience or learning the neuroscientific correlates of these states to be useful. Is it that it is illuminating another way of looking at it, or does it seem more like a missing bedrock? Or how do you see it?
So I've got interested in the law about 10 years ago because as an activist, it just seemed like things were getting worse over time. And then I realized the law is out of date with understanding human development, social psychology, neuroscience, and this notion that if you're a minor, you can be unduly influenced, or an elderly person with dementia, but everything else is a slippery slope. My work says no, they're actual, behavior, information, thought, emotional variables that one can go through any environment and, do some inventory to say, wait a minute, this is more authoritarian influence versus encouraging you to listen to your conscience or listen to your gut and your intuition and such. And so for me, it's part of the, how much of us are the physical brain and how much is consciousness something indeterminate that we just, experience consciousness, but we can't really, name it. And so for me, it's fascinating to learn there are different parts of the brain that have light up when looking at specific subvariables. And so in that way, I think it's useful to help the body of knowledge to realize, because I'm not someone who wants to subscribe to transhumanism, like, the Musks and the Teals, etc., who want us to be in android bodies and live immortally. Like, I like being a human. I want to be in my body. I want to encourage the human experience. And so I feel like love is not something that you can just say is a brain activation place, but it's a much more experiential, phenomenon. I don't know what this.
Right. I mean, years ago, the quest to kind of scientifically isolate or experimentally produce a phenomenon like love and then quantify it in some way or replicate it, quantify it, bring it under control goes back longer than we've had fMRI machines, of course, going back to the, Harry Harlow's experiments with, very cruel experiments with monkeys. But there does seem to be this desire to find some sort of, most recently, neuroscience is a really powerful idiom and area of research. And I think if you are interested in court cases and having some kind of legal foothold, it makes sense to really be able to refer to such research, because otherwise, there's been a long history of various ideas not holding up in court because it's very slippery. It's slippery territory, like in the, recently in the Diddy trials, Sean Combs trial, where women's texts and expressions of love towards him were taken as evidence that they couldn't possibly have been abused in the way that the court was, the prosecution was claiming. So it was a successful defense around some of these, complex phenomena. So maybe it does help to have neuroscience or have an understanding of it. I find it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Diddy case. It just happened that he was found not guilty of the more serious racketeering and trafficking charges. I thought it was clear that it was trafficking and racketeering myself, but I wasn't, consulted as an expert witness or even as a consulting expert for the prosecution. And it's a very unfortunate that, and this is another thing that I learned in the 10 years that I've been involved with the program in psychiatry and the law at Harvard Medical School, which is a forensic think tank, is that often judges and juries side with the side that has more money, who can hire the better storytelling lawyers who know how to do all this research on who's in the jury and even who to choose for the jury and how to manipulate them emotionally and psychologically to emphasize innocence over guilt and I think there's a whole bias against women anyway in when it comes to the power imbalance and the control that somebody like a Combs has on people. But this is for me the rock that I'm pushing up the hill in my latter
Yes.
parts of my career, because I really think for the future of humanity, if we don't get this clear, then it's just free play for all the authoritarians to enslave everybody.
I mean, interesting that Diddy's lawyer was Mark Agnifilo, I think I'm saying it right, who was the defense lawyer for Keith Raniere. Unsuccessful, but in a way, that case in some ways is a response in which they basically were successful in shooting down the racketeering charge, right? When the claim that racketeering has been overused, because it was one answer to the fact that complex systems of coercive control and undue influence and brainwashing have not been successful in court. So if you can focus on financial impropriety and abuse like racketeering, then you could be successful. But in this case, it didn't. Now there's been a pushback against that. So, it was really a remarkable defeat, as I understand it, because such federal cases.
Yeah, it was horrible. I was so disappointed, and I know I read a newspaper article that Combs got a standing ovation from his fellow inmates because he wasn't released, on bail because of his prior bad behavior, and he's awaiting sentencing for the charges he was found guilty of. But
it's remarkable a lawyer could stand up in court and say, read out a woman's text who's taken someone to court for abuse, and then say, this young woman just loves sex. That's what it is. He said something like, good for her. I mean, this is a woman who, she's gone to great personal, she's extended herself and put herself in great danger to bring this case precisely because it wasn't consent, that it was not consensual. But it's just amazing they can do that.
Yeah, and it comes back to I wasn't there at the court, and I didn't hear the prosecution's close or their arguments and such. But what I've learned is the adversarial approach to justice that we have in the United States is really flawed. And there really needs to be a framework when it comes to brainwashing and mind control. I added it to my doctoral dissertation. A law professor emeritus, Alan Shefflin, who wrote one of the first books on MK Ultra, I might add, back in '78, called The Mind Manipulators. I'm sure you know about it. But he created this social influence model that expert witnesses could use to say, let's look at the influencee and their unique vulnerability, the influencer or the predator or the predatory organization. And if the predator has, a clergy person or a professor. It changes the dynamic in that relationship to begin with, and much less looking at his framework of what are the techniques, what are the purposes, how does and this dynamic, as opposed to people walking around thinking I'm my own person, I make my own decisions, and if I make a bad choice, it's on me. Instead of they lied, they sleep deprived me, they and did all of these techniques.
Yeah, I got to talk to Alan Shefflin at your. I think you introduced me years ago, and it was lovely. He's a really wonderful man.
Yeah, and before he passed away, unfortunately, he had a stroke. He and I did 2 chapters on the dark side of hypnosis for an academic textbook for clinical hypnotherapy, and the chapter he focused on was MK Ultra, actually, and the fact that the one technique that Alan Dulles said they found that worked was hypnosis.
Oh, that's wow.
So that's
because people are always, and in fact, there's a new book on MK Ultra which says that they didn't discover anything. There were no findings, and Sidney Gottlieb claimed that it was just a big failure, and he was embarrassed, and that's the kind of common line. But that's a really important point. There's so many directions you can go in the resonant effects of MK Ultra. Its continuation under other programs and other names, but also. And the more subtle techniques, but also that point about hypnosis is really important. I have to go look up that article.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share it with you and such. But I went on to study NLP in the 80s and then became part of the Erickson Foundation. Erickson was part of MK Ultra, as you know, and started the American Society for Clinical Hypnosis. And that's what NLP was based on, was Milton Erickson's process-oriented approach to inducing altered states of consciousness. But he was a psychiatrist who was committed to doing no harm and wanting to help people. So I give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't consult with the CIA because he was malevolent. He just wanted to answer his government's questions about what he had learned. But what's now happening on the internet, and this interfaces with this whole topic, is the Doomscrolling, which was created by Asa Raskin. It creates a hypnotic trance state where you lose time. It's one of the features of a hypnotic state, and I was interviewed by Asa and Tristan for their Your Undivided Attention podcast. But right now, there's a stage hypnotist, Rebecca, from the UK, who's training people who want to be coaches and teaching them hypnosis, and they have no mental health training. And it seems to be all over the internet, and people are walking around oblivious to the inherent dangers.
Yeah, well, that's one of the questions of, I guess, just the democratization of these techniques. Just through the internet, you can encounter very powerful techniques that might have otherwise required access or initiation. There are problems with that as well, that model. But that's really fascinating about, I was just at a course in Amsterdam at the University of Amsterdam, and a graduate student presented a paper on scrolling as an altered state of consciousness, which goes along with precisely what you're saying, a kind of dissociation or hypnotic, out of body. In a sense, you're literally out of your body sometimes when you're infinitely scrolling or doom scrolling or, and just, I thought that was really, really fascinating because it goes back even to Robert J. Lifton. Okay, part of my research for my book was to go back into Lifton's papers at the New York Public Library, and I found these cassettes from his Wellfleet seminars, and he talks about this moment that I thought was seems pivotal, where he talks about 9 types of numbing, and from the acute, which would be someone in a Holocaust camp, surviving, but you maybe but like having to live in those circumstances, that would be acute numbing. But he also through these 9 types of numbing, he extends it into, things that are more banal. Like he talks about ordinary numbing, normal and ordinary numbing, just of every day. And he said, this concerns us all.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was, we're seeing that become ever more true and pressingly the case.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk to you after this about getting that reference from University of Amsterdam. And I read every one of his books. And as you know, he's who I credit for my entire career.
Yeah.
When I met him in 1976, but I did not listen to the Wellfleet tapes. So I'm jealous that you have something that he taught about that I'm not unaware of. But he's been a major force in my understanding trauma and dissociation. And he also taught me to look at psychohistory. He did the book on the psychological effects of people who survived the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombs. He was very, very involved with Physicians Against Nuclear Bombs and such. And he wrote a few books about losing reality.
That's true.
Instability of Truth. Losing reality about what's been going on politically and of great concern.
He's so prescient, so interesting, and also an actor in the story, which is interesting. Even his role in the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder from his own experiences is really fascinating.
Indeed. Yeah, it's great. Rebecca, there's so much more. I want to draw more wisdom out of you. And I also want you to share some of the other books you've worked on. I read your piece about the indigenous person that so much of science was referencing. And before we finish, I want you to talk about your future, what you think you want to be doing in the future. So share some more with my listeners, please.
One previous book that I've written a couple of books before, and this has been a wonderful time having finished this one to think back over why I got interested in this topic. But one of the books before this, I wrote a book called The Database of Dreams, which was really about this kind of quest to find a technology that could hold subjective materials from human beings. This was in the mid-20th century. So before there were digital databases, the idea was that, scientists for years had been collecting people's psychological test results, their inner preoccupations, their life histories, and their dreams in different tribal groups, Native American groups around the world, internationally. And the idea was, well, these are just sitting in moldy boxes, people's files, and anthropologists maybe hadn't published or they'd only done partial interpretations. Wouldn't it be great if we made a huge, vast database of dreams? And they didn't call it that, but I called it that. And I look at their labors to create a technology that could make, at a push button, you could recall somebody's dreams. Or, it didn't quite work because they just had microcards, but they did eventually store something in the Library of Congress. And in a way, I'm excavating. It's my own, I guess, psychohistory.
Yeah.
But in some ways, it's really about, I feel like it reflects on the present. What we're, now you can go, people are using AI to interpret their dreams. They're trying, in some sense, that these technologies can soon insert messages into your dreams, some people suggest, or if, no matter, depending on how intimate one would become with an AI chatbot, or even, I met someone when I've been doing these podcast interviews, and this man named Dave Asprey, who's a super interesting person. He's a father of biohacking. He was telling me that instead of meditating, he goes into a sauna every morning and talks to his chat GPT about deep spiritual issues. It's interesting that people are doing that. I can't say what the outcome will be of that. But if you think about potential, there are some potential dangers of this kind of intense subjective molding melding.
Yeah.
And I think my book, this earlier book, does get into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And my next project is for next year. I'm going to be writing about psychedelics and psychedelic therapy and its connection to brainwashing, its potential abuse, but also its, because of these states of suggestibility that are sometimes occur, but also I don't want to dismiss it, of course. And I think it has, I'll just be interested to look into some of its history, which also goes back to MK Ultra. Some parts of the history of
well, the
research with
LSD
psychedelics.
certainly, right. But yeah, so I've been teaching a bit about psychedelics and what clinicians need to know, because a lot of clinicians are rushing to give psychedelics to people for trauma, but they're not doing a history and finding out whether the person was born or raised in a cult and has like underlying issues that need to be addressed first because of their blind spot due to lack of training.
Exactly. I think if I teach a class on this, you have to come. And that's exactly what I'm interested in. Or we should just discuss it more.
Yeah, no, yeah. I just love to learn. I'm naturally curious. And I do think there's fantastic potential for use of altered states of consciousness. I know you're a meditator. I'm a meditator. So I'm not a fuddy-duddy who's closed to it, but I also think that some people have really had psychotic experiences from doing psychedelics, and whether it was a dosing thing or a setting thing or sexually abused, trusting a shaman, self-professed shaman, with no checks and balances and such, and people are being abused from that as well. But
it's not a panacea.
It's not.
Nor a magic pill, but it's profound for some people. I'm kind of with you on all of those. The question of potential and caution.
Yeah, indeed. So last words are yours, but I want to plug this book. I really want anyone who's a former cult member, interested in cults, and there's a billion podcasts and documentaries on cults, so I know there's a big hunger to know more. Well, this is by a professor at Harvard, History of Science, talking about this topic, and I really encourage people, ground yourself in the history of understanding what we know as, evidenced facts about what we've learned, and use your own good judgment to look at facts and reality test them, and don't make any big decisions when you're not sleeping properly or you're being pressured by somebody that you have to decide right away, and just other basic smart consumer things. And avoid binaries. I'm ranting a little bit. I hope you don't mind, Rebecca, but just avoid anyone who says it's black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, us versus them. Reality is much more complex.
Yeah.
Find out all the other positions that weren't in that binary. And if you're in a group that says don't ever talk to critics, or don't read any critical literature, or don't talk to former members, I say if it's true, it should stand up to scrutiny. Trust yourself, go to people that you trust in your family or friend group, and reality test, because if something is legit, it will stand up to this test.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what resonates with me is something I came to. I thought in writing this book, if brainwashing were a simple thing and you could just write a Wikipedia entry or a paragraph or something, or, there would be no point writing a book about it or investigating it for 20 years. But I find it to be a potential of every moment. And therefore, what you were saying about grounding is really important. And what it, it feeds on ungrounding. So we need to find ways to ground ourselves. And you talked about your experience as your grounding. Right. And also I use research as a kind of grounding. So.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't help but comment on your comment as we're wrapping up that Wikipedia, in my experience, has been terrible in the topic of brainwashing and mind control and cults, because there are endless number of wealthy cults that don't want the public to understand what are the facts. So there's tons of disinformation out there. They keep messing with my personal page on Wikipedia to twist it to make me seem less than what I actually have achieved in my life and my accomplishments. So be careful of Wikipedia. And AI was trained on Wikipedia. So when they say, oh, there's a lot of hallucinations, I point at Wikipedia as one of the problems, not the solutions.
Interesting.
Yeah. So Rebecca Lemov, congratulations. The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion. Thank you for being
so
on
much,
my
Steve.
podcast. Take
It was
care.
great to talk with you.
Great.